welcome to Know a Way Around. Today I will be talking about one of my all-time favorite topics, which is fairy tales. Specifically today, fairy tale movies. So feel free to grab a cup of tea, I certainly am drinking some, and sit down and come along with me. I wore my Beauty and the Beast rose necklace in honor of the occasion, and I am not talking about any adaptation of Beauty and the Beast in this video, so, you know. Before we begin, I really want to address something, which is racial and ethnic diversity and gender roles and feminism in film. I think this gets brought up a lot in the topic of fairy tale movies specifically, and I know that it's really important to talk about, and it's also a just very complicated, complex, loaded topic. This video isn't intended to go super into depth on any of the movies I discuss, and it's really not the focus of this particular video, but I do think it's really important to acknowledge, and hopefully we can have more discussions about it in the future. I will say that I'm kind of planning to do more in-depth videos about some of these movies in the future, so potentially that could be something that I could explore in a slightly better way then. I do want to acknowledge it, however, and if you have any thoughts regarding those topics and the movies that I mentioned, I would love to hear about them. Feel free to comment below, or I don't know if you guys have a way of getting in touch with me, but yeah, I would love to hear about it. So please share your opinions, and please be polite with each other as well. Yes, that being said, when I talk about these movies, I have sort of a rough outline for myself when I make these videos about what I want to talk about, but my script isn't set in stone. So I may choose to comment on some of those things as it pertains to these movies. Most likely I will be talking about gender representation and gender roles in these movies, just because I feel personally a little more qualified to comment on that at the moment. But just know that it's not a deliberate omission, and I think that's a conversation that's important to have, and maybe we can have it together at some point in the future. So with that being said, let's move on to our first movie. The first movie that I want to talk about today is the 1959 animated Sleeping Beauty released by Disney. Now this movie I think is kind of slept on. This is a really amazing animation for a variety of reasons. Obviously, the story of Sleeping Beauty, especially the more original kind of older versions of it, can be nothing short of disgusting. It's an intense story, and a lot of the older versions are nasty for a variety of reasons, and also quite troubling in regards to their treatment of women. However, I actually really think that this is a story that can be treated in a not disgusting way, and I think that the Disney animation actually does a quite good job of this. This movie is a movie that I love, not just for the story, but because it is a fabulous art piece. This movie is beautiful in every way, and the soundtrack for it quite literally is stunning. So let's talk a little bit more about the things I like about this movie. When I was going through and thinking about things to bring up, I was thinking about the reasons I like the individual movies that I'm recommending or talking about. And one of the things that really stands out to me about Sleeping Beauty is the art style. So things that I noticed when I watched the movie, very gothic art style, and I noticed that the color palette and some of the shapes used are very reminiscent of medieval illuminations in manuscripts. So doing a little bit of research, the movie is set in the 1300s, and we know that because Prince Philip tells his father to wake up because it's the 14th century. So, clue. We are not told when in the 1300s, so that's fine. But I did look up some artwork from that time period, and frankly, I don't know how copyright works on YouTube yet. I tried to look it up, I've tried to do the reading, but it's super complicated, and it varies for license to license. So I will not be including any visual examples in this video, and for that I apologize. But I looked up some articles and some kind of examples of medieval illuminations, and I was like, I might be onto something with this. The colors used are actually quite similar, except for Aurora's pink gown, which is another thing that is a whole discussion on it in and of itself. But when I was doing some research about that, I learned that the design director or the production designer for the movie Eyvind Earl, I hope I'm pronouncing his name properly, actually was specifically inspired by pre-Renaissance artwork and Gothic French artwork, among other things, when he was doing the kind of concept artwork for this. So I thought that was really cool. The artwork is gorgeous. It's just phenomenal. And the animation is amazing. This was a movie that was intentionally designed to be beautiful animation, and it's hand-drawn. So that's just something to appreciate when you watch it. Another fabulous component of this movie is the soundtrack. So the soundtrack was adapted by George Bruns, and it's actually based on the Tchaikovsky ballet score for Sleeping Beauty. So there are a lot of pieces in the soundtrack that are really familiar to anyone who knows about Tchaikovsky's work, but it's adapted flawlessly, very seamlessly, and the few kind of original pieces of music in it match so well. So it is absolutely gorgeous. Actually, the pieces that I'm thinking of may or may not be originals. I need to go back through and look. There are a couple of things that I don't think are Tchaikovsky, but don't quote me on it. As a side note, I'm actually making a playlist for this video as well. So like most of my videos, this one will have a playlist that goes with it, and you can get to that playlist by clicking on the link in the description. I will leave the link to my channel Spotify there, and I will include just some of my favorite scores from all of the movies that I'm talking about today, because soundtracks are really important to me when rating movies. So yeah, so Sleeping Beauty, incredible. One last thing that I really want to talk about as regards Sleeping Beauty is the character development and the influences. Now, I know that this particular story is one of the ones that kind of comes under fire a lot for its depiction of a female main character being rather one-dimensional and not really getting a lot of speaking time or character motivation. And I would like to challenge that perception of this movie, because Princess Aurora is only in the movie for about 18 minutes. And at first that seems pretty darn incriminating. However, I don't think Aurora is the main character of this movie. The three good fairies, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, are actually the main characters. And Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather are in the majority of the movie. They have three-dimensional characters, character arcs, and portrayals. And they actually are the primary decision makers and motivators on like the good guy team. The primary decision maker and motivator on the bad guy team is Maleficent, who also has a three-dimensional character. This movie absolutely passes the Bechdel test. Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather have quite a lengthy conversation together about how to keep Aurora safe. And I think that it's really important to kind of view the story arc through the fairy's eyes, because that's how it's told. And that's one of the reasons I love this retelling of Sleeping Beauty. Beyond kind of the reduction of creepiness involved, is that the fairies are the main characters, and I feel like that gets really overlooked when people talk about this movie. I don't think it's something I've really heard many people comment on, but this movie is less a story about a human royal family and more a story about a very old feud between one fairy and the good fairies, which I think is just really cool. You'll notice in the dialogue when the fairies talk about the humans, they talk about them being mortals, and you kind of get this sense that Maleficent has had it in for these fairies for a very, very long time, like before the humans were ever born, which I just think is so cool, and it gets really overlooked. So that's my first movie. Moving on to the next one. Also, these are not really in order of how important they are to me or how much I like them. These are just in order of when I thought about them and like wrote them down. So just a side note, that's why there isn't numbering or anything. Like I just threw them in any order that I wanted to. So my next movie is the 2015 live-action Cinderella movie by Disney. Now, this movie is one in particular that comes up in the talks of racial diversity, and I hadn't done a lot of research on it. I remember when I watched it in theaters, my impression of it was that it was fairly diverse, especially for the year that it came out. But I know that the previous Rodgers and Hammerstein version completely surpassed it in terms of racial diversity in the main cast. But again, that's not a conversation that I feel like I'm really prepared or to have right now or have the authority to have right now. So I would love to talk about it later with you guys, and if you have any comments about it, please leave them in the chat. This Cinderella is one of my favorites. This movie blew me away. When I watched this movie, I was probably at the height of my princess obsession. Or really not my princess obsession, like my fairy tale obsession. But it's kind of hard to say when the peak of my fairy tale obsession has hit me. It might not have hit me yet, to be honest, so it's hard to say. But this movie was exactly what I needed when I watched it. This is a really gorgeous example of an escapism movie that really presents still some difficult concepts, but in a really hopeful and optimistic way, which I really, really appreciate. The main tagline for this movie is "Have courage and be kind," which honestly has been kind of my own motto through a lot of things in my life, and I really appreciate it. Ella in this movie is a fabulous character, and I really like her portrayal quite a bit. I think she does a really good job of, her actress Lily James does a really good job of portraying kind of the struggle and the difficulties she goes through, and I like that she's portrayed as a little bit more of an introverted character, which I think is sometimes kind of rare for princesses in movies, so I quite like that. The soundtrack for this movie is beyond amazing. It is incredible. It incorporates folk music, so the song Lavender's Green that Ella sings through the movie is actually an old song that gets portrayed throughout the movie, and the soundtrack is amazing. Layered, complex, beautiful, incorporating many elements of classical and folk music, and I cannot gush about it enough, so be sure to listen to my soundtrack playlist that I made for this video, and tell me what you think, because I really think everyone needs to hear this soundtrack. One of the things that I love most about Cinderella is the production. So this movie is a movie that utilized practical sets in a phenomenal way. If you watch the movie, you can tell there is amazing, beyond incredible costume design, and very little CGI was actually put into this movie. So probably the most standout scene in any Cinderella movie is going to be the ball scene, where Cinderella goes to the ball at the palace, and this one did not disappoint. In this scene, the dancers and the extras and the main characters and everyone there are actually operating within a practical set. I cannot begin to describe how cool this is to you, so I'm actually going to link in the description a link to a video of behind the scenes and how they filmed the ball scene, because it is phenomenal. But they actually had, I think, several hundred extras, all dressed to the nines, wearing ball gowns, wearing suits, everything, in a practical set ballroom. So the set they built for this scene had real chandeliers that had actual candles burning in them. They had real musicians playing for the extras while they filmed their dance scenes, and they just really went all out. Like, they basically threw a giant party in a fantasy setting and filmed it, which I just am so obsessed with. It's amazing, and there's a reason that it looks so alive and so fun on screen, because all of the extras you see, they were essentially just at a giant fancy ball in beautiful outfits, dancing and having fun, which I love. And I think that heart and that energy and that excitement for ball really comes through on the screen, and I love it so much. I also really like the story of Cinderella, because Cinderella is someone who comes from an abusive family, a really horrible home situation, and frankly, hers is a story of perseverance and of holding on to your own character traits through abuse, which can be very, very hard. Her stepmother is absolutely horrible to her. A lot of emotional manipulation, like her stepmother holds in front of her the potential for being able to do things she likes and then takes them away at the last minute. And I think that a lot of people kind of unfairly categorize Cinderella as being someone who waits for a man to save her, but that's not what's going on. And I think especially this version really brings that home. Her goal is not to get married in the movie. Her goal is to survive. And I think it's really more a story about her true value as a person and as a beautiful person. And by that I mean beauty of character, not of physical beauty. She has a beautiful soul, is appreciated and valued by the guy she does end up with, and I think that's an important thing to notice about the story. It's about her holding on to those character traits that make her a wonderful person throughout a horrible, horrible ordeal, and when she finally gets an opportunity to escape it, that opportunity comes with people who actually value her for who she truly is, which I just really like. And I like that this version really kind of emphasizes that by having the characters sort of meet each other multiple times, and have like reasons to like each other. Like it's less of a I thought you were cute at this dance and more of a whoa, you're a really interesting person who surprises me and challenges me to be better myself. So I really appreciated that. Anyway, moving on. My next movie is the 2007 movie Stardust, starring Claire Danes and Charlie Cox. Stardust is one of my favorite movies, and it really I just feel like it gets ignored. Like, very few people have seen it. I don't ever hear people talk about it. Stardust is based on the novel by Neil Gaiman, and it's a very unique fairy tale fantasy movie with incredible world building. One of the biggest takeaways for me from Stardust is the phenomenal world building. It's a standalone story. It's not a well-known story, but in the space of, I don't know, an hour and a half, I don't know how long it is, they managed to really sell you on this universe, and it feels expansive, it feels detailed, it feels big. And I love that about this movie. This movie also has very lovable main characters, and one of the cool things about the movie is both of the main characters are kind of exploring the world for the first time. So you have a lot of fun stuff happening where neither one of the main characters actually knows what's going on half the time, which I find incredibly entertaining. I'm going to try to avoid major spoilers in this video, but I don't think this counts as a spoiler at all because you learn it in the first 10 minutes of the movie. But one of the main characters is a star, which in this universe are sentient, and it's her first time kind of on Earth or on a planet, instead of being in the heavens. And the other main character is a boy from England who's exploring this world for the first time as well. So you have this really fun interchange of the characters where, because she's a star and really old, she knows a lot of stuff abstractly but not in person, and because he's a human and a young adult, he knows a lot of stuff in person, but he hasn't grasped the abstract concepts yet. And I think that this movie is in a lot of ways about them kind of bridging the gaps between their respective knowledge of the world and coming to a place where they're on equal footing, which I really appreciate in a relationship. This movie is one that I will comment on in terms of gender roles. There are a couple of scenes that kind of, I think, unintentionally reinforce kind of classical gender roles for people, which I don't think is necessarily always harmful, but could be an interesting thing to discuss. If any of you have seen Stardust and would like to talk about it in the comments, that would be great. There's just some scenes of him learning sword fighting, her learning piano, that kind of thing, which, depending on how you see it and depending on the context it's portrayed in, can be bad or good. I personally don't have too much of a problem with it because it kind of fits their respective personalities, but feel free to talk about it below and see what you think. I think it's a good thing to discuss, and it's also a good thing to be aware of. None of our media is ever divorced from our culture and our perspective on things, and I think it's really important to watch these things with a critical lens and take away the good, but perhaps acknowledge some of the things they might be subliminally reinforcing. So anyway, I will say that this movie also has one of the most fabulous soundtracks I have ever heard. And I'm going to be saying that about every movie on here, basically, because all of these movies are movies where I'm obsessed with the soundtrack. This soundtrack just blows me away, and it will, once again, be on the playlist. Another really cool element of this movie is just the use of magic mechanics. It has a really fun magic system, and it has multiple plot lines that all kind of converge, which I really appreciate and I think is handled quite gracefully. This is a movie with a decent amount of fantasy violence. I personally never thought it was that gory. There's sword fights and stuff, but I never thought it was it's not gritty in any way. But I recently was watching it with someone and she was like, dang, a lot of people are getting murdered in this movie. And I was kind of like, I guess so. So I'm just going to say that if you're someone who really can't handle kind of fantasy violence type stuff, maybe be cautious when approaching it. Perhaps have a loved one preview it for you. I'm a sissy. I really can't handle a lot of that stuff, and it never really bothered me for some reason, so I don't think it's that bad, but just something to be aware of. There's also a theme of animal abuse by one of the villains. All I can say is they get their comeuppance in the end, and no actual animals were harmed in the making, so I guess that's kind of that, but perhaps a trigger warning there is appropriate. Moving on, my next favorite, or rather my next on my list of favorites, is the 2008 movie Secret of Moonacre. Now this is another one. I don't know anyone else who's really watched this movie, which is tragic because it was on Netflix for a really long time, and it is one of my all-time favorites. This movie is probably aimed at a slightly younger audience, but frankly, everyone in my family likes it, and when we watched it for the first time, I was like the same age as the protagonist, and my parents still really enjoyed it, so I think it's good for everyone to watch. But it does have a protagonist who's kind of in her early teens, a good time. It stars Dakota Blue Richards, and basically all of the other characters I think are of like equal importance in the plot, and I really didn't want to list like 15 different people, but you can look up the cast list on IMDb if you're really interested. Secret of Moonacre is based on the novel The Little White Horse by Elizabeth Goudge, which was published in 1946 and originally set in the 1840s. Now, I can tell you with this movie, they made quite a few choices which divorce it stylistically from either of those two eras. It is definitely set in something of a fantasy alternate universe to the one we live in. But I think that was actually the right choice to make, because I think if they had tried to make this movie set in either time period, it would have lost a lot of its whimsicality. And they definitely took the approach of kind of divorcing it. I've read the original novel, by the way, and it definitely has a little bit of that sort of like Victorian romanticism, like this is a morality tale type of thing happening, which it's still a great book. I would recommend it, but there's definitely a lot of kind of stuff that's like, you know, in the era was probably like, oh, how cool, how sweet. But modern day, we're just sort of like, oh, what? Like, I'm pretty sure the main character gets married when she's like 14. Which actually, I don't know if that was that common in the 1940s. Maybe the author thought it was common in the 1840s. I don't know, that's weird. She does get married to someone who's her own age, though, to be clear. It's not like a really, like, adult marrying a 14-year-old. She's, like, marrying another 14-year-old, but still, it's kind of odd. So anyway, moving away from that, they gracefully sort of didn't do any of that in the movie, which I really appreciate. Yeah, this movie is fabulous. Again, incredible soundtrack. But the thing about this movie that I really, really love, and what makes it so dear to my heart, is there is a variety of strong leads, both male and female. And what I particularly love about this movie is they do a really good job of having a teenage girl be the main character who is resourceful, smart, she's kind, she's caring, and she has a variety of strengths that make her a good leader, and she discovers those throughout the movie. It's definitely a bit of a hero's journey. She comes from a very sheltered life, and she learns her own strengths and her own power, which I really appreciate. But one thing that I love particularly about this movie, speaking into kind of the feminism of it, is this movie does not fall into the very common pitfall, which I see in a lot of fantasy, of a female main character sort of, or rather the audience kind of being signaled that she's a strong female character by her despising all traditionally feminine pastimes. For example, something that gets really bashed on a lot in media is embroidery. Now, I don't know why everyone decided that embroidery was the most oppressive, traditionally feminine occupation. Like, I really don't understand. Like, before probably like the 1810s, lots of embroidery was considered a masculine thing as well as a feminine thing. Like, I don't really know how many men were doing embroidery, to be honest with you. Like, I don't know if it was still considered a feminine pastime per se, but like both men's and women's clothes are heavily embroidered in past eras of history quite frequently, and embroidery is a gorgeous, beautiful artwork that takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of math. It takes a lot of planning progress, patience, tenacity. It's just amazing. I don't understand why embroidery is the thing that's like, hating embroidery is shorthand for being a strong female character in a lot of movies. Like, it really doesn't make sense to me. Enola Holmes did this, which I thought was so obnoxious. Like, she talks all about how all these things that her mother taught her how to do, and she spends all of her time, like, scoffing at traditionally feminine pastimes, But then her mom has these gorgeous watercolors of flowers that are central to the plot. And it's kind of like is watercolor somehow more feminine than embroidery? Like, both are artwork that heavily centers around color theory and being able to portray something well using your hands. Like, I don't understand how one is better than the other somehow. Anyway, I'm getting off topic, but basically what I really like about this movie is they have a female main character who can do all types of things. She's riding horses through the woods, she's setting traps in the woods for her enemies. She's kind of awesome, but at the same time, she's awesome at doing lots of traditionally feminine things like embroidery, and she likes fashion, and she does a lot of what she does dressed up in fabulous outfits, which I just really appreciate as a kid who also loved fashion. One thing I like about the fashion design is they successfully merged a very steampunk aesthetic with a very like gothic and royalcore aesthetic, which doesn't always work, but they 100% pulled it off, and the costumes alone are worth watching this movie for. But also, so are all the other things I mentioned. I will also say that this movie deals with a generational family curse, which is honestly one of my favorite tropes. It's really fun, and it makes an engaging thing that your kind of main character can't really get out of. So it really drives a good story. If you want a good excuse for why your main character can't get out of a situation, just throw a family curse in there and boom, everything's done for you. But this is a particularly well done family curse, which I appreciate. Yeah, there's also a good amount of the older people in her life sort of underestimating her, not because they're sexist, but because she's like 13, which I also appreciate, because I feel like I would be kind of troubling if her guardians weren't a little worried about some of what she gets up to, so A+ for that. Anyway, moving on. I could talk about this movie for hours, like no one's watched it. Please go watch it. Tell me what you think. My next pick is the 2007 movie Penelope, starring Christina Ricci and James McAvoy. I looked it up on Google. I didn't know how to pronounce his name, so I Googled it, and the little Google audio thing told me it was McAvoy, but I'm not convinced. So if you think otherwise, tell me. Anyway, this is another little-known movie. This is an urban fantasy movie. It's very 2007 in aesthetic, but I think in a way that aged well. You know, like it's very much of its era, but also sort of timeless. Kind of like the Star Wars movies. You know, like if you know anything about 70s fashion, you could absolutely see it in the Star Wars movies. But they are not bound by it. They are not slaves to it. And I think that this is really the same with this movie, Penelope. Like, the aesthetic is absolutely influenced by 2007, but also it transcends 2007. This is actually one of the rare movies, this is the only movie, actually, on this list where I didn't even really remember the soundtrack. Like, I couldn't even remember if there were original pieces of music written for the soundtrack. You know, a lot of movies in that era just had sort of like pop songs put on it. Yeah, I didn't remember. I looked it up, and there were some pop songs in the soundtrack, but there were also a couple of original pieces, which I love after listening to separately. So I don't know why I didn't remember them, but I did put 2 of those into the playlist. So you're welcome. This one is really good. It is a fabulous story, again, about a family curse specifically. In fact, the family curse is the primary motivator for the entire plot. But more than that, it's a story about self-love and how generational trauma can affect someone. And really, it's a story about acceptance and family, which I appreciate. The main character is suffering from a family curse that gave her a pig nose, basically. And the story is about her learning to kind of accept herself, learning that the outside world is a mixed bag. Not everyone's going to hate her, and not everyone's going to love her. And it also has a male lead who really does a good job, I think, of portraying also a three-dimensional character. I think this movie does a really good job with kind of the relationships between the characters. A lot of the characters have very complicated relationships with each other, and most of them have very different ways of seeing the world, and I think that's portrayed really well. It's a very heartwarming movie, it's funny in places, and I really like the main character in it. She does a really good job of kind of going for what she wants, and I just love this. This movie is about her learning courage and how to accept and love herself, and frankly, I think that's something that we could all stand to see. So, this one, it's kind of difficult to talk about without giving spoilers for the plot, but I will say that I really appreciate this movie's kind of interpretation of her happily ever after, and it maintains that feeling of being like an urban fairy tale, but also kind of incorporates some of the magic of living in a big city. Like, the characters really, appreciate the beauty of the landscape around them. And it's really fun to see a fairy tale that's not set in like a bunch of woods. Because don't get me wrong, I love woods as much as the next person, but that's basically where every fairy tale is set. So I really appreciate this sort of urban fantasy with the whimsicality of a traditional fairy tale. Moving on from that one. My final movie for this video is the 2005, I almost said 2004, 2005 adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with Georgie Henley, Anna Popplewell, William Moseley, and Skander Keynes. Now, this movie, oh my gosh, even just listening to any part of the soundtrack makes me feel incredibly nostalgic. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was one of my favorite books growing up. The entire Narnia series was one of my favorite things growing up. My dad always read books to us when I was little. We weren't really a TV family, but my dad read books aloud. And The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was kind of the first chapter book that I remember him reading to me and my sisters. And as such, it holds a very deep place in my heart. I was like 4 or 5 when this movie came out. No, I was 5 or 6. Sorry, I can't math. I was 5 or 6 when this movie came out. And I still remember it coming out because even when I was 5 or 6, The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe was already in my mind as one of my favorite stories. And I remember kind of being not sure how I felt about it because like I had loved the book so much. But the older I get, the more I realize just how fabulous this movie was. So let's get into it. One of the greatest things about this movie is the way they kind of expand on the theme of World War II being a motivator for the kids' personalities. In the book as well as the movie, we are led to understand that the entire kind of instigator for the plot is the fact that the kids are refugees fleeing from London, having to leave their parents behind during the war. Their father is presumably a soldier. Their mother is staying behind in a city that's being bombed all the time and sending them away so they can be safe. And obviously that has tremendous emotional impact on these kids. They're quite young. Well, they have a range of ages. There's 4 of them. But the youngest, Lucy, is quite young. And obviously this is going to be a hugely traumatic experience, and it really influences the choices that the kids make. And I think that this adaptation, this movie version, really does a good job of portraying that. Even when they're in a magical fantasy land where, they're still in danger, but in a lot of ways they have way more people kind of helping them and rooting for them than they did in the real world, or rather the world that we live in. You can still kind of see how those things have impacted them. In the book, one of the ways you can see this is that Edmund famously decides to ally himself with the White Witch after she gives him Turkish delight, which doesn't really make sense from like a modern perspective, but if you think about it as him being a kid who just came away from like severe rationing in a war-torn city and is tired and traumatized and scared and has, had his food cut short because of it, it actually makes a lot of sense. The White Witch makes him feel important, she makes him feel safe, and she gives him something that he hasn't been able to have in a really long time. And understanding those motivations is important to the plot, and this movie does a really good job of portraying why the kids make the decisions they do. And it also does a really good job of portraying love and redemption and sibling care. The kids in this movie did an amazing job acting with each other. The acting is phenomenal, and it really is a good portrayal of sibling relationships and also siblings who really only have each other in a very difficult period of their lives. I also think this movie does an amazing job portraying the truly fantastical elements of Narnia. C.S. Lewis, in his books, always describes Narnia as being basically like the most amazing place. There's so many amazing things about it, but it also has really, really terrible struggles. And interestingly enough, Narnia struggles very frequently throughout the series with colonialism. It's kind of a repeated thing that happens, that an outside influencer will take over Narnia and stifle the things that make it uniquely Narnia. Which is something that I don't really have time to get into in this video, but I think it's really important and interesting to be aware of and think about, especially considering the time period and the place that C.S. Lewis lived in. So yeah, I think that this movie is fabulous, it's amazing, and frankly the soundtrack is probably the best fantasy soundtrack I know of. Like, no holds barred, this soundtrack, honestly I get emotional every time I listen to it, because it does such a good job of portraying the emotional complexity and the beauty and yet the sadness of the place that it's about. And yeah, it's just amazing. It's incredible. You fall in love with Narnia even when it's at its darkest point, and this movie really portrays that and really conveys kind of the love and safety and the character development that the kids gain as they are in there. I also really love one thing about this movie, which is that at the very end, when the kids have come back to our real world and they miss their home in Narnia because they lived there for like 20 years or something, there's this feeling of, you know, sadness, but also hope, because at the very end of the movie, you are given a sign that perhaps they will be able to return again, which we know they do. So that's great. But I really like that they incorporated that in the movie, because it was sort of implied in the books, obviously, but that's hard to do without like an omniscient narrator. And so I really appreciate that they incorporated it tastefully and well. Actually, I think it's the end credits piece is titled Only the Beginning of the Adventure, which I really like. I really like the emphasis put in this story on growth and change as things that can impact you emotionally, but that aren't always like 100% negative, right? Like the kids are sad to leave behind their home in Narnia, but you know that they might be able to go back, and also they're able to see their family and loved ones again. So I think that is super important. I think it's really cool. I will also say that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a story impacted me hugely, because I really identified with Lucy when I was younger. And having a range of characters of various genders and ages is really important in that movie, and the book, because growing up is messy and complicated, and I feel like C.S. Lewis really portrays that well. And jumping off of his work, this movie really portrays that well. The kids are all going through different things and reacting to things differently based on like their age and their experience, and you really just get a sense of that in this movie. So I appreciate it. Also, because I am incapable of talking about a movie without talking about the costuming, I love the costuming for this movie. They did a really good job of establishing the kids in 40s England in the beginning, and I'm not an expert on 40s clothes, but they kept it simple, they didn't do anything too crazy, and they really established them in the place and time at the beginning. And then in Narnia, they did an amazing job of selling me on Narnian culture, clothing, color schemes, all of that. Fabulous, fabulous job. I will say, this is another one of those movies where they managed to do animated animals, and it's not like super uncanny valley. So I would say to definitely check that out. All right, lovely people, that brings me to the end of this video. Obviously, if you liked the video, feel free to give it a thumbs up. Please comment below about your thoughts about any or all of these movies. I would love to hear them. And if you have a particular movie in this list that you would like me to do a more in-depth discussion on, I would love to hear it, because honestly, I'm really passionate about all of the movies I discussed in this video, so I would be happy to do a more in-depth video about any one of them, or multiple, honestly. Like, why stop at one? So please let me know. I would love to hear about it, and perhaps give me a couple of aspects of the movie you would like to hear more about too. Like if you want me to talk more about the music, if you would like me to talk more about the costuming, I guess I only had one animated movie on this list, but if you want me to talk about animation or special effects, just let me know. I would be happy to research those things and get that out to you. So have a lovely rest of your day. Have a fabulous, fabulous rest of your week, and hopefully this video brought a little bit of happiness into your life today. I'm Noah, and thank you for watching.